Hi, it's Willa. Don't be scared that you can hear my voice but you can't see me. I'm going to be talking about Putnam's anti-skeptical argument that the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," simply must be false. Just in case you weren't paying attention in class or you were sick that day, the brain in a vat is a hypothetical scenario in which a person's brain is removed from the body, suspended in a vat of life-sustaining liquid, and provided electrical impulses identical to those the brain would normally receive. This would serve to simulate reality, and the person with a disembodied brain would continue to have normal conscious experiences, unrelated to objects or events in the real world. This scenario serves to support philosophical skeptics who raise issues with the definition of knowledge. It's hard to see how the brain in the vat scenario can be ruled out. And if one cannot rule it out, then, according to the skeptic, it would be wrong to say that we can know we are in the real world scenario rather than the brain in a vat scenario. To embrace the skeptical view would entail relinquishing certainty of any belief, creating a world that spans the chasm from wishy to washy. Putnam begins his argument by stipulating the necessity of intention and connection in representation. He uses an example of an ant crawling on a patch of sand, tracing a line behind it. The line happens to take the recognizable form of Winston Churchill, but Putnam asserts this tracing would not, in fact, be a depiction of Churchill. In support of this idea, Putnam points out the ant, after all, has never seen Churchill or even a picture of Churchill, and it had no intention of depicting Churchill. Similarity is not a necessary or sufficient condition for representation. The ant could not possibly have been thinking of Churchill when it traced this line, and without that intention or connection, the tracing cannot be considered a representation of Churchill. Now you might be thinking, that's all fine and good, but what do ants and Churchill have to do with ruling out the brain in a vat hypothetical scenario? But Putnam proceeds by introducing his premise that intention is necessary for representation in the brain in the vat scenario. If a person were a brain in the vat, all their perceptions would be illusory, by definition of the scenario. The person's idea of what a brain is and what a vat is would be entirely based on false experiences. In other words, the person trapped in this distorted reality would have no conception of what a real brain is or what a real vat is. For the person to say, "I am a brain in a vat," would be completely false, because this person cannot reference these objects accurately. It is not completely about intention. The brain in a vat may have all kinds of complex intentions, but what the brain in the vat does not have is a connection to real brains or real vats. Depiction requires a connection to the object being depicted. With no knowledge of the world outside his simulated reality, the person whose brain is in the vat would have no means of understanding or describing his condition, the same way the ant, with no knowledge of Churchill, could never depict him. Putnam's argument can be broken down thusly. Premise 1. Connection is necessary for representation. Premise 2. A person in the brain in a vat scenario would have no understanding of external reality and therefore would not be able to reference it with the appropriate connection. Conclusion. If a person in the brain in a vat scenario says, "I am a brain in a vat," that statement is false. While this argument is valid and sound, I do not believe it is a strong anti-skeptical argument. Skeptics claim it is not possible to have adequate justification for knowledge. They reference scenarios like the brain in a vat to demonstrate our precarious understanding of the world. We have no grounds for believing our senses and experiences accurately reflect reality. Putnam has shown the brains in a vat cannot think or say that they are brains in a vat, but he has not disproved the possibility of such a condition. The argument is grounded in semantics, as it touches on the limitations of the human language.
Hello, we're talking about language.
The fact that an individual in the brain in a vat scenario would lack the language and frame of reference to understand and express his situation is not enough for us to dismiss skepticism and trust our senses and experiences. For a person living the brain in the vat scenario, to say or think, "I am a brain in a vat," would be false. Now, consider a person experiencing reality, not the false reality generated by the vat. If this person were to look upon the brain in a vat and say, "There is a brain in a vat," that statement would be true. Although Putnam would contend we must be the ones outside the vat, not the ones who are trapped, because we cannot possibly be brains in vats, examining this dichotomy in perspective segues into the preceding analogy. A simpler analogy to the brain in a vat scenario would be the idea of opposite day. On opposite day, the word is suddenly corresponds to the meaning of is not, unbeknownst to the speaker. The day before opposite day, a person could make the true statement, tomorrow is opposite day, because that person is existing external to the distorted reality of opposite day. For someone to wake up on the morning of opposite day and say today is opposite day would be false, however, because on opposite day, normative statements like this one have opposite truth value. It would still, in fact, be opposite day, but the individuals experiencing it would lack the ability to express that fact. Returning to the brain in a vat scenario, I do in fact believe such a scenario is impossible, but for different justifications than those of Putnam. Considering two versions of reality, one in which we are accurately perceiving and interpreting our surroundings, and another in which we are disembodied brains in vats being fed electrical impulses to simulate an elaborate virtual reality, the former scenario is arguably simpler than the latter. One measure of simplicity is the number of entities posited. While the real-world scenario stipulates the existence of the given individual, as well as all the entities he is experiencing, the brain in a vat scenario posits the existence of the individual's brain, the vat, a simulated reality, and an external reality. Thus, the real-world scenario is simpler insofar as the entities it posits. Another measure of simplicity is the number of assumptions a theory entails. The real-world scenario assumes our human senses are trustworthy. In other words, we are experiencing our surroundings precisely and accurately. The brain in a vat scenario assumes a person's brain is capable of being removed from the body, placed in a vat of life-sustaining liquid, and fed electrical impulses identical to those the brain would normally receive. This scenario also assumes these impulses would be successful in simulating a virtual experience indistinguishable from reality. Thus, the brain in a vat scenario relies on more assumptions than the real-world scenario. Using these measures of simplicity, I would employ Occam's razor to argue the brain in a vat scenario is implausible. The principle of Occam's razor was devised by William of Ockham, who said, "Among competing hypotheses that predict equally well, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. Other, more complicated solutions may ultimately prove to provide better predictions, but in the absence of differences in predictability, the fewer assumptions that are made, the better," or something like that. It would therefore be more logical to conclude it is far more plausible we are experiencing our surroundings according to reality, not under the complex circumstances of the brain in a vat scenario. If you have any further questions, please direct them toward the Willa who exists externally from this video.